Sol, Do, Mi. Major chord, major triad, 7th, 5th, 3rd, major 7th. Tetrachord, tetrachord, ton-ton, semiton, ton-ton, semiton. Minor, ton, semiton, minor 3rd, and then major 2nd, leading to tonic. Top in major, bottom in minor. Dominant, flat 6, minor 6, leading tone to tonic, semitone, augmented 2nd, gap. So on the 1st, 4th, and 5th, we have major triads. On the 2nd, on the 3rd, and on the 6th, minor triad. And on the 7th, diminished triad. When we think about the circle of fifths, and we play the scale of C major, Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Si, Do. We have just played Fa, Do, Sol, Re, La, Mi, Si. The 7 perfect fifths becoming step motion by jumping 1. And therefore the circle of fifths of each tonality starts on the subdominant of the scale in the case of Do majeur, C major. 1 is F, 2 is C, 3 is G, 4 is D, 5 is A, 6 is E, 7 is B, and between the first and the last, closing the circle, is the diminished fifth, or the triton, 1, 2, 3 tones, which is not perfect, therefore being a tension interval diminished fifth, it needs a resolution. Semi-step up melodically and down. That is when you resolve the diminished fifth, opening. But you also can resolve it, closing. Again, semitone. Of course, then if you do the first one, FB, you finish in C major, resolution, perfect cadence, dominant 7th, major triad on the dominant 7th. But if you close it, you have to resolve in F sharp major. This way, the resolution in C or in F sharp, the two resolutions, they also create a triton. So the triton is at the end of every cycle of 7 perfect fifths. So if we take the C major scale, with the bottom tetrachord ton semitone being exactly symmetrical to the top tetrachord ton semitone. The one starting on the tonic, the other one on the dominant. Then you could, like construction blocks, add one on top of the top. But because of the ton semitone, you're obliged to add the sharp, F sharp, fa dièse. And if you start on Ré, then you have to add Do sharp, C dièse, C sharp. Confusing the Do's and the C's. But the point is that every time you add another tetrachord, so you have none of the sharps in C major, one F sharp in G major, two in D major, three in A major, four in E major, five in B major, six in F sharp major, etc. Until 7 in C sharp major. After that, you start with the flats. If you add a tetrachord under, then you F major, B flat key signature, B flat major, two flats, E flat major, three flats, A flat major, four flats, etc. until 7 flats. Circle of fifths sharps, circle of fifths flats. Between the center, C major, Do majeur, and you arrive at F sharp, and on the way down, and then G flat. So you have on one ending F sharp touching the other ending G flat inharmonically. By the sharps of the flats, you reach the other pole of the circle of fifths. Do, Sol, Ré, La, Mi, Si, Fa sharp, Do, Fa, Si bémol, Mi bémol, La bémol, Ré bémol, Sol flat. Now the fact that the circle of fifths allows for a sequence reproducing the pattern, you also could do it with modulation. And then if you want to be, you can end in another key. Using the circle of fifths as a clock through which you go. So you can also not show it by the melodic fifths in the bass. You can use with inversions. So it sounds more melodic, more step motion, more close to the step motion. The chords by themselves have resonances of thirds. So the third, the fifth, the seventh, the ninth, the 11th, and the 13th, if it's on the dominant. And you obtain again, instead of fifths, you obtain in chords the notes by the thirds. Circle of fifths, scale, singing, step motion. The system is relatively simple until we add alterations. The tuning allows that because of the well-tempered tuning, because the unisons. So you can be in any key, not only in a single key in which you tune the instrument. But what's interesting is that if you study the chords first and foremost, normally the inversions, as their name says, is changing the order of the notes. So the root third fifth becomes third fifth root and fifth root third. That is when you exchange the notes being their functions, third, fifth, and root. But if you use the function on the same root note, then root is C for the root position, since we have to have the third stacked up like shelving. Then if C then becomes the third, then the root is the third under. So it's an A flat chord, which then, first inversion being a sixth chord, and not a root position 5 triad chord, then it becomes A flat major is a first inversion on the same note, but changing the function from tonic, obviously, but root into third, into fifth, and then the root being a fifth under. The second inversion, 6/4, compared to the 6, which is a third and a 6. 6 chord, 6/4. So on the same note, with the root under for the third and the fifth, but on the same note. In this way, you don't think about the notes changing places, because it's easy to confuse notes with function. It's going with the territory. This way you isolate function by changing its function on the single same note. So you introduce in the practicing these alterations I mentioned, because you don't have an E flat and A flat in C major. In C major, the 6th degree we saw earlier is minor. So the point of the story is that if you think about the chords with their inversions, root positions and different inversions, then you think about the order of the notes, and you can practice them on the same note, or just with the same notes inverted. Once this confusion is cleared, then you can play with different patterns of reproducing the sequence of root position, 6th chord first inversion and 6/4 chord second inversion of triads, chromatically up. Let's say this is the root, and your 6th chord first inversion chromatically will be on C sharp. Then if you chromatically rise 6/4 on D, root position on E flat, first inversion on E, second inversion on F sharp root position, first inversion on G, second on A flat, root position on A, first inversion on A sharp, second inversion on B, and tonic. Your sound. So what it teaches us is that we can think the chords as roots and inversions on their own notes, or on the same note function changings, and then eventually practicing it in order to really think it outside of the box, in this case by allowing ourselves a chromatic rising for each root and two inversions, root and two inversions, root and two inversions. And if I play it with the roots in the bass, you'll hear it. Of course, that is when you deal with the chords on their own. Once you think about the chords in society, their hierarchy, the dominant is well named, is owning the terrain of the tonal system, determining by the leading tone the tonic. Melodically, semitone, as we saw earlier with the tetrachords. But in the root is the dominant, which is a fifth above the tonic. Therefore, thus we call the perfect cadence. Leading tone to tonic, dominant to tonic in the bass. And in the 4 parts resolution, you add the third voice. After all, you have the root of the third, the leading tone, so you have to have a fifth. And if you do 4 parts, SATB, bass, alto, tenor, soprano, then you have a common tone, since you have 4 voices for 3 voice chords. In this case, the G is common. So the idea of organizing the chords in society is to use step motions in the resolutions of a bass with figured or suggested chordal notes to be harmonized, and always searching for common tones so that you minimize the jumps or the leaps in the melodic line of the voice setting of the voice leading. So for instance, for the perfect cadence, and please note, you have to always think singing, imagine choir, perhaps quartet, but legato. And especially don't repeat the common note, the G in this case. So you can sing it's E, Do, Sol, Re, Mi, Sol. Okay. Don't forget that the right hand is harmonized, quite layered in 3 parts, soprano, alto, tenor, but the bass line is melodic, so the intervals in the left hand don't hold, they move. Step motion or with leaps. What the bass line does is a melodic motion, and on each of these harmonizations that you have to place a chord triad in this example, you have to make sure you don't do just the root positions, though you could to mark down the terrain in the first bed. So you know which chord does where. But then you have to find the combination between root positions and inversions in order to obtain a melodic line. It doesn't need to have a single way of developing these melodic, beautiful, hopefully singing lines. You could have different disposition. You can start with the tonic in the soprano, or then you can imagine to spread more like choir or string quartet compared to, or perhaps the decision about the disposition is to do with the arrival point of the cadential striation. For instance, you start on the tonic, you do some other degrees, like the subdominant and the tonic. So when you could just think about chords, you could do. So the reason for which in written harmony and keyboard harmony as well, of course, by consequence, you don't want to play parallel fifths or octaves. It's mostly because the purpose of the voice leading is to find melodic lines that are singable, that have their own beautiful phrasing and shape, while they function as chordal completion to the bass line. So the voice leading is the melodizing of the other three parts above the bass, the soprano, alto, and tenor, and therefore the avoidance of the parallelism creates a sense of more elaborate voice leading with the contrary motion rather than, and therefore also makes you hear, when you don't repeat it, the common tone between tonic and dominant. The common tone is G. Many times people play the repeated notes of the common tone, but the beauty of it is to hold it, therefore to hear it as being common to the tonic and to the dominant. Now between the dominant tonic, in this case, and the subdominant, the common tone is the tonic. So between the first two, tonic dominant, the common tone is the dominant. And between the tonic and the subdominant, do. And then if you do the circle of fifths, you can have the degrees in the bass: 1, 5, 2, 6, 3, 7, 4, 1, 5, 2, 6, 3, 7, 4, 1. Or the opposite, dropping: 1, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. I think it's always difficult to figure out the hidden presence of the circle of fifths when all the voices are melodized by step motions or shorter leaps of thirds rather than fifths or fourths, contrary motions, and common tones. And then you hear, or more elaborate. What I meant by more elaborate is that since we can use the chords in society, the major and minor chords, subdominant, dominant, tonic, cadential, 2 second degree minor, 5, 1. If we start on the 3rd degree minor, then 3, then 6, and then 2, 5, 1. It always ends with 5, 1 for the cadential exercise. So you can start from 5, 1, from 2, 5, 1, from therefore 2, 5, 1, from 6, 2, 5, 1, 6, 2, 5, 1. Okay, what is above 6 in the circle of fifths? If you had 6, 2, 5, 1, you have 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. Or then you bypass some of the parallel audition of fifths. It's always good to avoid the idea of holding the bass notes. They are melodic. And in this case, if you do 1/5, which is so-called plagal cadence to the tonic, because it doesn't have the leading tone of the dominant perfect cadence. Cadence is, of course, punctuation. naturally at the end of a phrase or a piece. And sometimes you start being more bold in your thinking of the degrees, the chords, and the voice leading, and how you behave in society with equal voicing for each. Nobody accompanies, all have a motion and a direction, and a point A to a point B. Voices, each of them. The common tones, the contrary motions, or the leaps. Or the, in this case, you can do a 1-5, then 6, then you go 3, and then you go 4 and 1, and you do. We're producing a pattern for the sequence by different degrees. In this case, dropping fourth in the bass, tonic dominant in this case, and then you reproduce it to the third. On Do, on La, on Fa, and do also. Or by step. Or different interval, but let's say the third. Then you have to do, after you did Do, Sol, and La, Mi, you do Fa, Do, because you reproduce the pattern. And you study to play it well also by holding the common tone. And play legato and beautiful in the sense of aesthetics. And you sing the alto when you play the soprano. Do, si, la, sol. But you don't play it at the same time. Fa, mi, you play 3, you sing 1. In this case, the tenor, sol, the common tone, sol, mi, do. Or the soprano, mi, do, si, la, sol. You see, you have a step of a scale in the melody because you use the third of the root, the fifth of the next root, which is a dominant, the third, the fifth, the third, the fifth, always in comparison to the bass to the top emanation. Of course, you could do or all these are right because they're part of the 3 notes of the triad for each of those chords. Or the idea between the motions in the bass notes moving in sequence, reproducing a pattern, is to make you practice on the keyboard the different chords in their successions and their proper voicing, behaving in society with each other politely, and having each their own function but also their own inner beauty. And when you don't want to work only or beyond sequences on the keyboard harmony, then the first practicing that was to use the circle of fifths with the chords, in this case rising by step or by third or by step. You can start working on the so-called figured basses where you don't have just patterns to reproduce of sequence, but motions where you bypass the fifth to go to another degree directly. Instead of doing 2, 5, 1, you can do directly 2 to 3. And then 4, 5, 1. If not, you have to go. It's nothing wrong with going through the circle of fifths, except that you learn little by little when you get more fluent with the chordal progressions in the tonality, as I call it, society, how to hear the voices as well as how to combine chords progressions which are not only based on the circle of fifths, even if they're there in the underlining, but you bypass and you go from a degree to another, like, sorry, from 3 to 4 directly, instead of 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 to 1, or even this cadence is the most interesting cadence in my humble opinion, the so-called deceiving deceptive cadence. It's interesting. The major cadence is the perfect cadence. The weaker cadence is subdominant tonic, without the tension of the tritone. It's a more spiritual uplifting and less human tension, because it avoids the famous leading tone. But if that is the case, then the pieces in terms of phrases end very quickly. And how do you have a tactic to delay the ending is to go, all the melodic notes go as they should to the leading tone, to the tonic melodically. But the bass doesn't go to the tonic. But because we have common tones with the 6th degree, A minor in this case, the relative minor, we have 2 out of 3 common. That is C and E, or Do Mi, between Do Mi Sol, La Do Mi. And that is something that we have to always take in account when we think about the combination of notes, how many are common. It has to become part of the thinking process, and therefore if you do 5-1, it's finished. If you do 5-6, but you still resolve your leading tone, then you delay until you do a 4-5-1. So already 5-1 becomes 5-6 for 5-1. So this plagal cadence is the ending, the perfect, the more ultimate ending, and this is the delay tactics. So you could even go to 2 and 5 and then 1. And you could have also another delay tactic of not finishing with the perfect cadence on the root, but on the first inversion. And then 5-6. So you last longer before you end, since the purpose of the perfect cadence is sort of to lock the ending, the arrival of a phrase, of a sentence, of a structure, of a piece. But you can delay it until you need to conclude, to bring it to a closure. And you can use those delay tactics to make it held longer. And then you can also, the dominant, use the second inversion, the 6/4, as a neighboring tone, with the common tone being the dominant. With exchanges of voice, and the tenor and the soprano, mi, re, do, si, mi, re, do, si. So in 4 parts realization of triads, obviously of 3 sounds, as their name says it, you're mastering the flow of singable step motions combined with common tones. But some of these step motions have to be in opposite directions. This way you create a sense of melodic drive energy with the bass line. Once you add the fourth note to the chord, the triad becomes a seventh major, or with a minor seventh with a major triad, we call it dominant seventh, or with a minor triad with a minor third and a minor seventh, or with a diminished triad and a minor seventh, half diminished, or all minor thirds, then diminished seventh. That brings by this extra fourth note a whole beautiful world of combinations for consonants and dissonances to start again from the root with the inversions over on the same note, or chromatically, another way down, devil's advocate. I didn't hold the common tones because I wanted you to hear the beautiful, bittersweet, intense, and sometimes touching dissonances of these minor seconds compared to the major sevens in the inversions when you do. By essence, in all the inversions, you'll have a minor second since it's major sevens. So if I play the same descent but holding the common tones, sorry. Of course, with the decaying piano, you don't hear when the juicy dissonances come to fruition. When we saw the major triad with the inversions chromatically up, and we hear combined now same way with the dominant, major seventh. These things are always sophisticated and subtle, because the more you add notes to a chord, the more you interact for the inversions with different notes, and then you obtain different, beyond the factual organization of the system, the sound production of the major seventh with its inversions is particularly, therefore, attractive for the sounds because of the sevens and major and the minor second in inversion. To give you an example, the dominant seventh in the same chromatic rising with inversion sounds compared to the major. And just out of memory curiosity, the triad. I think it's important, and I find it very attractive actually, that music theory is beauty, not only by its function and its intellectual construction, and therefore enjoying the simplicity of the beauty of the functions and their successions of chords, of bass line notes, and of cadences, and of producing patterns on sequences, but the fact that some of them are even more attractive, in my humble hearing, than others. But that is a question of the more you master the complexity And the more you understand the simplicity of the whole idea behind these chordal progressions, the more you enjoy how they sound, how they just resonate, how the dissonance and consonances become part of your exchange between tensions and releases, which is ultimately what the tonal system is about. You accumulate tensions until a delay release, or you have a lot of tension releases right away. For instance, that's what we call the secondary dominance. For instance, in C major, you have a tonic dominant doning. That is an interesting neologism, Freudian. You don't have a doning. It's dominant to tonic. But this descent melodically from the fifth to the bottom note, fifth, is reproducible on each degree of the tonality, since in C major you have Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Si, Do. Therefore, if you do the same for the second degree, D minor, Re minor, of course you add the alteration, Do sharp, but you're not in D minor, you're just a secondary dominant in C major on the second degree. 5 of 1, 5 of 2, 5 of 3, 5 of 4, 5 of 5, 5 of 6. You could do 5 of 7, but the problem that 7 being not a major minor but diminished triad, you cannot make a secondary dominant tonic pattern because that doesn't exist, but there's no leading tone. So at least for the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth degree, you have secondary dominance. Many people considered that when you had a foreign tone in a tonality, and that's why Do major, C major is so easy demonstrative, because diatonic. As soon as you hear a C sharp, you could think I'm modulating to D minor or major. Well, D major wouldn't be part of C major, because D minor part of C major. The second degree is a minor triad. But you don't modulate unless you stay longer and you organize yourself. Let's say you do this, and then you go. You think, perhaps I traveled and stayed in the other country of D minor. But if I was on the way only passing, then in fact I'm only adding a dominant to each of my degrees. So I'm spicing the C major with sharps that are the leading tone to the secondary dominants going to their tonic degree of the C major, which would be 5 of 2 D, 5 of 3 E, 5 of 4 F, 5 of 5 G, 5 of 6 A. Therefore, there is a more subtle hearing to develop, to define when you modulate and how proportionally longer you stay in the new tonality, or if you just use a secondary dominant pattern to go to another degree, in which case the melodic line, if you do it by step, with the leading tone being semitone, then your melodic line becomes chromatic. I was silly of mine to sing there. Even in head voice I have limits now. But anyway, the point of it is that it's easy to confuse an alteration for a modulation, or to define at which point you still consider it within the tonality in which you are. For instance, the first period of Bach define C major, 1, 2, 5, 1. If I play with the roots, he does with inversions. And then he does the circle of fifths to go to the dominant through the circle of fifths. But he does it with inversions. So we could say, okay, I was in C major, then I moved to G major, equal same proportion, and he has short but close to what they are secondary dominants with a minor ninth, 5 of 2, 5 of 1, subdominant with chromatic movements, but basically 4, 5, 1. So if you reduce the skeleton of the first prelude harmonic progressions to have 1, 2, 5, 1, 6, but then 5 of 5, and then 2, 5, 1 in G major, 5. Then you return to C major, 2, 5, 1, 4, 5, 1. So what does it matter to know, to define, to assess, to hear beyond the structural group numbering of degrees to which the baseline goes and the harmonization that is displayed in this Bach first prelude of the Well-Tempered? Is because, in fact, the proportions are part of the construction, the symmetry, the group of bars, the cadences. It's all about this imaginary edifice that is structured by a harmonic progression without a melodic line, since in the prelude there is no melody. Well, actually, Gounod did that much better than me by writing an Ave Maria melodic line over the first preludes of Bach harmonization. But necessarily, if you want to add a melody, you can invent another melody as long as you keep the structure of the harmonic progressions of Bach. You can do but the idea behind the understanding of the harmonic progressions in the first prelude is to follow the melodic line of the bass. And what it teaches us by his demonstration of such clarity of the canvas of the C major prelude is that we have group of bars in C major, then we go to the dominant or we go to G major. It's not the same. We can visit the dominant as a secondary dominant of itself with the F sharp, but still within C major, or we define that after these chords, now this is a cadence in G major to stay, which he doesn't. Therefore, you could imagine to construct your thinking that you never leave C major, by the proportions of the time you stay in it, and that you punctuate a cadence in the dominant with its own secondary dominant, and then you return to the C major. Not tonality, but degrees. So this way you've never left C major, you just went with the secondary dominant to present the dominant G major. And then subdominant. It's important to take always in account the meaning of dominant subdominant, because we call it so because of the scale. Second degrees, subtonic, overtonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, overdominant, leading tone, tonic. And of course, it's easier to think the 7 notes in step motion, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, because if it's harder to sing fa, do, sol, re, la, mi, si, the 7/5. But if you think in the order of the 7/5, the tonic is the second note, since we have to start with the subdominant in order to have the 7 finish with the leading tone, and therefore create the tritone that logs the system in each tonality. So in fact, the subdominant is under the dominant in the step motion of the scale, which is not to confuse, that is a perfect fifth under the tonic, just like the dominant is a perfect fifth above the tonic. So in ways, with a circle of fifths, melodic bass, you hear how the subdominant, which called so melodically, but here is the pendant to the dominant, being the upper fifth. The subdominant is the bottom fifth. So in fact, it's pivotal around the tonic, which gives the name of the tonality, the dominant that determines it with the leading tone in it, and the subdominant, which gives you the other entity of the notes, which is by thirds, do, mi, sol, si, G, G on the sol, dominant, G, B, D, and on the do or si, down, to go to F, you have the A. Again, your 7 tones in thirds, like in sevenths, or in step. But because we think in step, since we sing in step motions, it's not very difficult to understand why, because of the human range. We don't want to confuse the harmonic positioning strategically of the subdominant under the tonic by a fifth, the plagal cadence, with the common tone being the tonic, and the leading tone, sol, do, 5/1, with the common tone being the dominant, do. And if we only think of it in the terms of melodic spaces in the scale, F, G, Fa, Sol, you go from the subdominant to the dominant direct and you finish on the tonic. You don't go through the tonic. But the famous 1-4-5-1. Why is it famous? Because it is the most, let's say, determining cadence, a tonality that signs in the tonality, which is the purpose of the cadential situation. And that's what Bach does in each of its preludes. Like the first, he doesn't do 1-4-5-1, he does a version of it, 1-2-4-5-1, 1-2-5-1. But in the second prelude, he does 1-4-5-1 or 7-1, which is a version of 5. So you determine, in order to say in which tonality you are, who's your tonic, who's your dominant, which implies the leading tone. By essence, you can even start directly as Beethoven's First Symphony on the dominant, because that determines more than the tonic, which gives the name of the key. The subdominant is the weaker cadence, but it is a complementary cadence. It's the one that is without the tension of the tritone. That's why it's often called the Amen cadence at the end of worshiping. Amen, compared to the leading tone. It's different ways to determine and define the tonality in which you are, by which cadential progression you'll be there, determining it. And if you add another third to obtain the 7, then you have a perfect cadence with the diminished, well, the minor 7th rather, which is called dominant 7 because the triad is major. And then by essence of the dominant, you have then the leading tone in the 3rd, 2nd degree in the 5th, and the subdominant in the 7th. And you have in the same chord the lock of the tritone diminished fifth that attracts the resolution. No wonder Beethoven starts his first C major symphony on the dominant, with the dominant seventh and the tritone. Very provocative. The audacity of which escapes us today, but in the Viennese school where Papa Haydn established the form of the sonata form, therefore the symphony, he was expected to start on the tonic. Then you define with the fifth degree, then perhaps you delay tactic with the deceptive. Then, of course, the half cadence to avoid the full perfect cadence and end. But you have to delay the ending and not you finish as soon as you started. You completed it. So the storytelling asks for modulations later, but even if not, for secondary dominance. And then so you have many ways to organize these delay tactics, as I like to call them, about a delayed ending because you want to be developing a storytelling through harmonic progressions, melodic lines, singing, spoken, with or without words, but implying by the tension release the sense of belonging and needing to resolve in order to release the tension. And if you're in C major and you go to the sixth degree with its secondary dominant, that's the relative minor. You could very well just go directly there because you have two common tone out of three. And you can go, but if you want to establish it, you can use the secondary dominant leading tone of A minor in the case of C major, instead of just going. But, you know, the truth is that the harmonic progressions allow you to combine them in ways that you sort of customize them for your musical expression, which is why it's so striking that so many composers of different styles between Bach and Ravel, and before Bach, and for some after Ravel, to take purposely two sort of bookends, composed, created, expressed their own creativity, stylistically, romanticism, classicism, post-romanticism, post-classicism, or neoclassicism. You have nothing in common stylistically between Schubert and Ravel, Beethoven and Brahms, but in fact, what is common is the fact that they all use the same rules for the game. But they customize it to their own taste because it corresponds to what they have to express. Now, there are composers like Schoenberg who reached a point where they decided that enough is enough. Everything's been said with this language system rules. We have to reinvent them, to reorganize the order of the tones, not with a hierarchy that existed until now, dominant, tonic, circle of fifths, thirds, chords, inversions, progressions, sequences, cadences, delay tactics, all these things, major, minor, common tones, contrary motion. All these are basics, facts that they all learn or learned, and decided to reorganize the 12 notes of the chromatic scale compared to the 7 of the natural into a different order, series, serial, and define a new order. It's change the language with the alphabet. So It's interesting and striking that so many stylistic differences exist between composers who use the same system that allowed them to customize it to the point to which the regular listener who is not versed in harmony in terms of the grammar of music that it is, thinks differently when they hear music by Bach or Tchaikovsky, because the emotion, the extraction of the expression, the levels of surprise by the mood settings of the modulations, of the ways they organize their differently for their expressive purpose. The common language to the root of the grammar commonality escapes the listener. And whenever you go outside of that system, then it becomes unaudible by essence, since you have to first create a knowledge, a habit by ear or by eyes, if you can read music, to learn about what are the order of the notes of this series, in order to appreciate the combinations that come from this new order. But you cannot intuitively do it by the acquired audio tools, by listening to music that is so-called classic, even if it has so many styles between at least the Baroque and the modern, but in more before Baroque. But nevertheless, once you get outside of the tonal system, you have to recreate ecosystems in which you can recognize or expressively appreciate the emotional and the intellectual combinations, which you do more intuitively when you hear a Schubert song you've never heard before, but you don't need a chart to figure it out, because your ears hear and your psyche feels the tension and releases, the expression of emotion or happiness or delay or longing or expecting or driven and playful and dancing. That same thing with soundtrack for movie theater as performances of sometimes of the silent films, but of course written scores for the non-silent films. They're part of the storytelling, and very often they use these cadential situations of tension release or delayed tactics or diminished sevenths to create a sense of unsettlement compared to the wellness of the triads that are suggested emotionally by their harmonic combinations of tension releases and dissonances and consonances, which of course change according to the type of chords you use or the type of sophistication you add to the expression. But then the storytelling of the film gets more meaningful, because you get sort of called psychological signals that the music brings you, that gives depth to the characters' atmosphere of acting, moving, or thinking. It's atmospheric as well as action, not only, well, both will be sometimes. And so that's why the idea of harmony is that it's so internal harmony. If you have a intuitive good ear and perhaps perfect pitch, but not only, you can express and appreciate how other people express themselves from the pieces you play or you hear, and you realize which is in major, in minor, where are the sequence, where is the cadence, and you are, it's like a GPS, you know a little bit better the terrain, or you can read the music through listening it. Not that you can read the notes, because you cannot guess them unless you have perfect pitch, but that's not the purpose again. It's the organization of the meaning of the harmonic progressions, as I say, tension, release, longing. And that's why I think this commonality of the grammar allowed for composers of different styles to write things that are fundamentally of their own times, different in breaking with the preceding time. The Romanticism breaking with the Classicism breaking with the Baroque. Well, it's very unsubtly said, but on the large scale, it's sort of right. And then after the Romantic era, you have the modernity that rejects the Romanticism. So emotion, and it's always the duality between the brain and the soul, or the heart, wherever the siege of the soul is. But at the root of all these harmonic progressions is the ear that hears them, and the inner ear through the thinking of the reproduction, in this case of a sequence, is where the notes go, where the voices go, where the common tones stay, and start thinking in layered organization of voicings while they produce chordal harmonizations to a bass line. All that is simple to say or display, but it's a very patient and long time that it has to take to become part of the hearing of the musician or the music lover. It's not exactly like learning a foreign language, it's more getting accustomed to some of its specifics in terms of how they pronounce the words, what type of diphthongs they use. And the more you can recognize them when they're spoken, even if it's difficult, because when it's spoken, it's more difficult than when it's written, when you learn another language from the book compared to the first language that came by ear from the so-called mother tongue. And then you can start developing an acquaintance, and you say, oh, I like the music of Mendelssohn because I feel more comfortable. His harmonic progressions fit my understanding or my psyche, my emotion. And some people say I don't like Wagner, but I prefer Scriabin. Some people say I hate Scriabin, I prefer Rachmaninoff. They don't know why they say that. Perhaps they would be able to know better once they enter a little bit more in their musical idiom. It's almost like reading a book. Of course, you know the alphabet by studying in school, and so you can read a book. Do you really understand it, or you just on the surface read it? Okay, perhaps. But with the same letters, you can read another book. Or you can write the book. But you don't have to be a writer to be able to read. And unfortunately, you have to be a musician to read music. And if music is only heard, then you don't go through the written portion, even if it's improvised with charts like Baroque or jazz, or totally detailed written, at least notated, for the so-called classical general time periods that are covering more than that style. The listener is in a communality of being with the music expression, and I insist for the fact that the harmonic rules explain, organize, define, makes the hearing more informed even before the reading, if reading is to be of the music. And therefore, the more subtle appreciation of the stylistic differences in how one composer treats a given cadence compared to another one. Things which naturally escape the first hearing, which is based on what these functions of the chordal progressions precisely create emotional or intellectual reaction in the listener, which is the purpose for which they were organized the way they are, or they were. Well, they are because they're eternal once they're written, so we can listen to it as if today, even if it was in another time period capsule for which and when it was written. But therefore we enter in a situation where our ears hear the music as something that is told to our soul, also to our brain, and we try to filter the one from the other, just like we can make, therefore, in reading poetry or literature, we can appreciate a different style between a crime novel or a poem. We know it's not the same, even if it uses the same letters and words sometimes, if not every time. But the words in different situations mean different things, and therefore chords also by themselves, a tonic, a dominant, but you put in society and you start modulating secondary dominants, common tones, inharmonic modulations, more subtleties to the sharps into flats and all that. The way you call things, it's not that as important because you feel when you hear it. That's the purpose of them. But when you can also name them, you realize that you know where is the noun, where is the verb, and where is the complement, and where is the subject, and you organize a sentence. And you can reorganize it if you write it, or you can understand what is the purpose of the way it's written by the writer in this order or this different order of the syntax of the words. Same thing with the music. It's not a single language. It's many languages, since every style can create its own within this communality of the tonal rules. But there are also important situations where you get out of it. Debussy with the whole tone scale onwards, or in a close circle that in a way doesn't go further, but other with the atonality, the lack of a being from ancient Greek privative, so no tonality. Or then reorganize a new order of the notes and make your own tonality or your own series of notes. And it can be 12 like the chromatic notes, but in a different order like Schoenberg, or perhaps they can be 5 pentatonic Asian music, or you can organize it in a different way. It depends of the effect that they'll produce on the listener. Ultimately, I think that is the connection between the production and the reception of the music and the sharing of it. Sung, played, performed, marched, organized, danced, praying, music for spiritual uplifting, for enjoying dance, the gesture of the body language, singing, or combined with singing and dancing and voicing, like in an opera or an oratorio. So the whole idea is that music is some kind of a medium between what we cannot express in words, even if they're lyrics or without, and something that we need to define for ourselves in order to organize the chaos of nature between the tonic and the dominant, subdominant. We have hierarchies, so there is a necessity to organize that. And then you can transgress it by going directly from one chord to another that makes then some kind of signature of yours, if it were. That's more subtle than that. But put in words like this, I think it should illuminate the meaning of why we need to know better what we love, because we are curious to know it better. And that curiosity brings us to know how it's built, how it's made. Not only a cooking recipe, but retrofitting the understanding of why I'm so moved or driven by this piece. It's not because the dominant is there or the subdominant or this modulation comes, but it's an ingredient among ingredients that could be part of the combined effect. None is all is not, but you find ways to define which more influences your infatuation or your affections for the given piece, style, genre. From a song to a mass, from a piece to a structured organization of a long, many movements symphony, you can go from the micro to the macro with the same clarity, because in a way it's a construction game of fifths, thirds, chords, sevenths, whatever you add, or you retract, or reorganize, or alter, or modulate. It doesn't mean that you will love it because you understand it. I think it's because you love it that you want to perhaps understand it a little better, or just a little.